Hey friends, recently my cat Pradeep suggested that we take a trip to the French-Canadian province of Quebec to drink in the eccentric architecture and sample the fine cuisine. As of now, Pradeep and myself are only fluent in English, so it dawned on me that we might have a hard time getting by. So as a gift for his birthday this year, I bought him a subscription to Babbel. Babbel is one of the best language learning apps out there right now, with their lessons being scientifically engineered to maximize progress while being fun and engaging. It was designed by people who understand the science of linguistics, and maybe even the science of cats as well, and the result is perhaps the single best language learning tool on the market. Babbel is so confident that they offer a 20-day money-back guarantee, but with the progress Pradeep and I are making, I can see him and I being a lifelong customer. And after gaining the approval of myself and my cat, Babbel is celebrating by offering 60% off their subscription. All you gotta do is click on the link in the video description below. On October 28th of 1975, Melinda Loveless was born as the youngest daughter of Larry and Marjorie Loveless. Some years earlier, Larry had been drafted into the United States Army and was sent to fight on the blood-soaked attritional battlefields of South Vietnam. The experience left him with deep emotional scarring, and as a result, he began to behave very strangely upon his return. Larry began conducting numerous extramarital affairs and was once caught trying on Marjorie's makeup and clothing. When confronted on his infidelities, Larry suggested that he and Marjorie partake of the southern Indiana swinging scene. And by 1974, the Loveless family were living in the upper-middle-class suburb of Floyd's Knobs, Indiana. Their finances were flush and their lifestyle gave the outward appearance of happiness and prosperity. Yet under the surface, all was not as it seemed. Larry remained violent and abusive and refused to share anything but a meager portion of his income with his wife and 3 daughters. Instead, he squandered his income on impulse purchases of cars, motorcycles, and firearms. Extended family members often described the Loveless daughters visiting their homes with empty stomachs, and how the idea of 3 square meals a day was almost completely alien to them. Meanwhile, Larry Loveless was far preoccupied with driving his wife into neighboring Louisville, Kentucky, to search for wife-swapping opportunities. He would often pretend to be a doctor or dentist and introduce Marjorie as his girlfriend. The practice led to several instances of group intimacy, with Marjorie finding them increasingly more disgusting. During one such meeting, Marjorie became so despondent that she attempted to take her own life. She made several more attempts over the years that followed, some of which were witnessed by her young, impressionable daughters. On another occasion, the girls witnessed their father beat their mother so badly that she had to be hospitalized. The extent to which Larry Loveless abused his daughters is frankly sickening, and there would be no way to adequately describe the horrors he inflicted on them without incurring a community guideline strike. If you wish to know the details, I suggest you look it up on your own time, but be warned, what occurred in the Loveless house was nothing short of evil. Thankfully, by the time Melinda was 5 years old, her parents had become passionately involved with the Graceland Baptist Church and had sworn off drinking and swinging. Larry went on to become a preacher, while Marjorie once again footed the family's bills by working as a middle school nurse. One could be forgiven for assuming that Larry had completely changed his ways by the time he became a man of God. But unfortunately for his wife and 3 daughters, the reality was quite different. At one point, when young Melinda Loveless began to repeatedly misbehave, Larry arranged for her to be subjected to a brutal 5-hour exorcism. The incident traumatized her beyond belief, and the move only cemented Larry's reputation within the church. But before long, everything he'd worked towards came crashing down when it emerged that Larry had assaulted one of the members of his flock. But before long, everything he worked towards came crashing down when it emerged that Larry had inappropriately touched one of the members of his flock. No charges were ever filed, but the scandal rocked the church and Larry was forced to flee with family to avoid the fallout. The end of Larry and Marjorie's marriage finally came in November of 1990, when Melinda was just 15 years old. Melinda had a friend over, and whilst they were changing outfits in her bedroom, Larry crept up to the crack of the door and began spying on them while they changed. Yet moments later, Larry heard a noise behind him in the hallway. It was Marjorie, and she was holding a knife in her hand. She didn't give him a chance to speak, and although Larry eventually managed to wrestle the knife away from her, the wounds he sustained ensured a lengthy hospital stay. Larry never returned home to his wife and daughters and instead moved down to Florida, where he eventually remarried. This might seem like a long-winded way to introduce a person, but I can assure you, understanding Melinda Loveless's history and psychology are essential to understanding what came next for the traumatized young woman. Around the same time her mother sent her father to the hospital, Melinda began dating a girl named Amanda Hevron. It had been an anxious, excitable, but innocent relationship, but after her father abandoned the family for the sunny climes of Avon Park, Melinda's behavior began to deteriorate rapidly. She got into fights at school, began experimenting with narcotics, and often lashed out at Amanda when the subject of family came up. As a result, the couple began to drift apart, and it's at this point that a young lady named Shonda Scherer enters the picture. Amanda and Shonda had met early in the fall semester at Hazelwood Junior High, and ironically their blossoming friendship had started out with a fistfight. The pair were sent to detention, and through some subtle note-swapping, they began to get to know one another. By the end of detention, Amanda and Shonda had developed a deep romantic attraction. They soon began dating, but instead of breaking things off with Melinda, Amanda Hevron kept their mutual affairs a secret. She maintained the ruse until October of 1991, when Melinda uncovered the infidelity. Naturally, the already emotionally fragile Melinda was distraught and placed the blame squarely on Shonda for stealing her girlfriend, quote-unquote. After several death threats, Shonda's parents transferred their daughter to a nearby Catholic high school in late November of 1991. A number of these death threats were handwritten, and after the Scherer family forwarded each of them to the local police, they were assured that the issue would be dealt with. Melinda received a brief visit from the cops, and after breaking down in tears under the force of their questioning, she assured them that her threats were empty and were fueled by heartbreak, not bloodlust. The holidays passed without incident, and the Scherer family came to believe that conflict had been averted. But they were wrong, and Christmas of 1991 would be the last Shonda would share with her family. On the night of January 10, 1992, 17-year-old Lori Tackett picked up two of her friends in their hometown of Madison, Indiana, and drove down to Albany to meet up with Melinda Loveless. The group then drove over to Shonda Scherer's home and Tackett's car, and after parking outside, Melinda told the girls to go to the door and introduce themselves as friends. Once Shonda came to the door, the girls claimed to be friends of Amanda, who wanted Shonda to meet her at a place known as Mistletoe's Falls, a ruined stone house located on an isolated hill overlooking the Ohio River. Eventually, Shonda agreed to accompany the girls in Tackett's car, but when she climbed into the passenger seat, she discovered it was a trap. Melinda Loveless had been hiding in the back seat of the car, concealed under a thick woolen blanket, and within seconds, Shonda had a knife to her throat. Melinda began interrogating Shonda of her relationship with her former girlfriend, but there were no correct answers to her questions. No matter how honest Shonda was, no matter how much she begged for mercy, Melinda continued to beat her about the face and neck, whilst intermittently threatening to cut her throat. The girls drove Shonda out to an abandoned cottage known as the Witch's Castle, and once inside, they bound Shonda's arms and legs with rope. Melinda began to taunt Shonda as she sheared the hair from her head, telling her she wasn't so pretty without her bouncing brown curls. Shonda was then beaten and partially stripped before the girls threatened to set her on fire, but fearing the flames might be seen by passing motorists, she was bundled back into Tackett's car and then driven from the area. Sometime later, the girls arrived near a densely wooded area back near Madison. Lori Tackett joined Melinda in leading their prisoner to a dark abandoned building located just off a logging road lined by huge, thick pines. There, Shonda was beaten, strangled, and stabbed repeatedly before being locked in the trunk of Tackett's car. Assuming that Shonda was dead, the girls drove over to Lori Tackett's house to clean themselves off. Then, at around 2:30 a.m., Laura and Melinda went out for a drive again. Whilst they were traveling, the girls suddenly heard screaming coming from the trunk of the car. They pulled over, opened up the trunk, but as they did so, a terrified Shonda Scherer lunged at them, coughing up blood as she attempted to escape captivity. Laura then grabbed a tire iron, then beat her already bloodied prisoner until she was silent. She later claimed to have felt Shonda's skull fracture and splinter as metal collided with bone. Then when she was finished, Lori raised the gore-soaked tire iron to Melinda's nose and told her to smell it. Having assumed Shonda was dead for the second time, the girls drove to a gas station near Madison Consolidated High School, pumped some gasoline into the car, and bought a 2-liter bottle of Pepsi. Yet almost as soon as she'd bought it, Lori opened the bottle of Pepsi, poured out the soda, then refilled it with gasoline. It was a grim omen of Shonda's fate, and after driving her to a place known as Rippy, the girls dragged her from the trunk, wrapped her in a blanket doused with gasoline, and set her on fire. But Shonda was not dead, and only when she'd stopped writhing and screaming within the confines of the blanket did her killers finally walk away. Lori and Melinda then drove to a McDonald's where they apparently joked about how Shonda's corpse had resembled the meat they were consuming. After getting some sleep, Laura and Melinda traveled over to Amanda Heverin's house to tell her what they'd done. Melinda believed that such a display of violent dedication would win Amanda's heart, but as you can imagine, the young woman was beyond horrified at the admission and refused to believe that Shonda was dead. It wasn't until Lori Tackett showed her the trunk of the car, complete with Shonda's bloody discarded clothing, that Amanda realized that her claim was genuine. Fear drove her to silence, and when Melinda Loveless made her promise to keep quiet about what she'd done, Amanda complied, then retreated to her bedroom to grieve in secret. Lori and Melinda then went about their business, having assured that Shonda's body had been burned to ashes, but that couldn't have been further from the truth. Earlier that day, 2 brothers from the small town of Canaan were headed for a day's hunting at the Jefferson Proving Ground when they noticed something lying by the side of the road. At first, it looked like a badly decomposed piece of roadkill, but as they slowed down to get a better view, they realized what they were looking at. It was the badly burned body of a young girl, who had evidently been crawling alongside of the road for quite some time before she finally expired. The brothers called 911 at exactly 10:55 a.m., and following a brief period of questioning, State Trooper David Cam and Jefferson County Sheriff Buck Shipley joined forces to begin an investigation. Following a brief analysis on the scene, law enforcement's initial theory involved a drug deal gone wrong. In their experience, the kind of brutal violence the victim had been subjected to was reminiscent of violent narcotics gangs, and they suspected that hardened male criminals were responsible. But as we know, the reality was very different. By the time the girl's charred corpse was discovered at the roadside, Shonda Scherer's parents had already noticed that their daughter was missing. After calling around neighbors and friends all morning, they filed a missing persons report with the Clark County Sheriff. The deputy who took their statement warned them that they'd have to be patient, as runaways sometimes took weeks to make contact or return home. The Scherers braced themselves for a lengthy, anxiety-ridden ordeal. Little did they know, Shonda's fate would be revealed in less than 12 hours. Around 8:20 p.m., 2 hysterical 15-year-old girls walked into the Jefferson County Sheriff's Office with a shocking confession. Their names were Hope Rippey and Tony Lawrence, and they claimed to have been the 2 other girls present at Shonda Scherer's beating. Having been stunned and appalled by the news of her horrifying immolation, they were desperate to offer their cooperation in exchange for as lenient a sentence as possible. Once it was confirmed that the charred cadaver was indeed Shonda Scherer, Melinda Loveless and Lori Tackett were promptly tracked down and arrested, with the state declaring they'd both be tried as adults due to the severity of the crime. The fact that the 4 teenage girls would be tried as adults meant that the death penalty was on the table, a prospect which horrified Americans from coast to coast when the news began to circulate nationally. To prevent the issue from snowballing into a wider political issue, the judiciary were quick to offer the girls a plea bargain which lowered the maximum penalty to life imprisonment. One judge cited the serious mental health issues that each of the girls suffered. and claimed a psychiatrist had discovered Lori Tackett suffered from a terrifying form of borderline personality disorder characterized by horrifying hallucinations. An extensive history of the Loveless family's abuse at the hands of their patriarch was read out to the court. Melinda remained chillingly indifferent to the details being made public, while some of those in attendance were close to tears by the time her history of abuse had been recounted. At the conclusion of their trial, Melinda Loveless and Lori Hackett were sentenced to 60 years in prison, plus 10 years medium supervision upon release. Despite her cooperation, Hope Rippey received an extensive 35-year sentence, owing to the fact that she played an integral role in binding and torturing the late Shonda Scherer. Tony Lawrence, on the other hand, was only convicted of criminal confinement and received the lowest sentence of 20 years imprisonment. Lawrence ended up getting released in December of the year 2000 after having served just 9 years of the original 20. Hope Rippey was released in April of 2006 but remained on probation until April of 2011. Lori Tackett served almost 26 years before being released on January 11th of 2018, the 26th anniversary of the crime she was convicted of. Finally, Melinda Loveless, the broken young woman who masterminded an act of pure, unadulterated evil, was released from Indiana Women's Prison on September 5th of 2019. She had served just over 26 years, almost double the length of time she'd been alive at the time she murdered Shonda Scherer. The incident had been fictionalized in a number of true crime primetime TV shows, including Cold Case and Law & Order, but perhaps the most jaw-dropping of television features was an edition of Dr. Phil, which aired on May of 2011. The show featured Shonda Scherer's mother and sister, who harshly confronted a now-adult Hope Rippey. Rippey tried her best to distance herself from the crime, but welcomed the judgment of Shonda's still grieving relatives. It makes for extremely uncomfortable watching, and unlike other very similar attempts at resolution, the meeting is characterized by a stark lack of progress and an absence of forgiveness. But then again, how many of us could truly forgive someone who put one of our loved ones through a living nightmare before finally burning them alive? On November 29th of 1859, Jesse Harding Pomeroy was born in Charlestown, Massachusetts, to Thomas J. Pomeroy and Ruth Ann Snowman. While Jesse was just a baby, his father enlisted in the Union Army and marched southward to put down the slave traders of the Confederacy. It was a noble pursuit, but it left young Jesse without a father figure during his crucial formative years, and when his father did finally return, he was but a shadow of his former self. Thomas Pomeroy had no interest in raising his two boys. He returned from the war with little passion for anything but chronic alcoholism, and although Ruth Ann tried her best, she was unable to keep young Jesse's behavior from degenerating into savagery. Around the time of Jesse's 13th birthday, several neighborhood children spoke of being lured to a secluded area by a slightly older boy. Once alone, the boy would begin to savagely beat them with a leather belt, and on one occasion, a young girl had her face carved up with a knife. The local constabulary conducted an investigation, but sadly, no viable suspects were identified and the attacker was unpunished. Ruth Ann Pomeroy was terrified that her two darling boys would suffer a similar fate and berated her drunkard of a husband for his callous indifference. In the end, she left him, moving to South Boston with her two boys in order to protect them from danger. Yet to her horror, the attacks in the old neighborhood seemed to cease from the moment they moved, and instead recommenced around their new South Boston home. Local children became terrified, and their fearful parents kept them off the streets after sundown. Yet to his mother's grim curiosity, young Jesse never once seemed afraid that he might be targeted, and came up with a variety of bizarre excuses as to why he should be allowed to roam the streets at night. After weeks of being unable to prevent her son from his late-night prowling, and with the number of victims mounting, the truth became evident for all to see. Little Jesse Pomeroy was the boy responsible for the string of violent beatings, and he was arrested by a pair of Boston police officers. Jesse was originally sentenced to 4 years at the State Reform School for Boys at Westborough, Massachusetts. However, after just a year in confinement, he was determined to be mentally deficient and was released back into the care of his mother in February of 1874. By that point, Jesse's mother ran her own dressmaking shop and was generating a respectable income for a single mother in the late 19th century. His brothers supplemented the household income by selling newspapers and planned to learn a trade once an apprenticeship opened up. In short, Jesse had everything to look forward to in a family who were prepared to love and support him following his release. He could have done almost anything, pursued almost any passion or vocation, yet Jesse chose the only thing he ever really wanted in life: inflicting pain and suffering on those weaker and smaller than him. During March of 1874, 10-year-old Katie Curran went missing from the streets surrounding her childhood home. Jesse's mother begged her son to assure her of his innocence, and the boy swore on his eyes that he had changed his ways. As the days went by, Ruth Ann began to detect the scent of something rotten in the basement of her dress shop. She didn't object when a brace of police officers darkened her door. She simply directed them towards the basement and offered up the location of her bloodthirsty son. The young Miss Curran had been hastily concealed in an ash heap and had been horrifically mutilated both before and after her death. Chunks of her thigh were missing, with clear bite marks surrounding the indentations. Her eyes had been removed, replaced with small pebbles and dirt, and a great deal more had been stuffed down her throat. Sections of her skin had been sliced and peeled away as if her killer had performed some kind of amateur dissection, exploring the flesh which lay beneath. It's said that the police officers who caught young Jesse that day dragged him back to his mother's dress shop to make him look at what he'd done. One officer sought to confirm his guilt by outright asking the boy if he'd murdered little Katie Curran. Jesse said nothing. He just looked up at the officer and smiled. The case of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts versus Pomeroy was heard in the state's Supreme Judicial Court on December 9th and 10th of 1874. Jesse was pronounced guilty, but with the jury's recommendation of mercy on account of his young age. Given the extremely brutal nature of the crime, this request for leniency was completely disregarded by the presiding judge, who assured Jesse that he'd burn in hell before sentencing him to be hanged. Pomeroy's attorney, Charles Robinson, filed 2 exceptions which were overruled in February 1875, at which point Pomeroy was sentenced to death by hanging. But then, in a highly controversial ruling, the governor of Massachusetts refused to comply with his own executive responsibility. After that, he not once but twice refused to comply with the rulings of the Massachusetts Governor's Council, and furthermore refused to resign, even when threatened with removal from office. The confrontation made for one of the most intensely controversial political ordeals of its time, and almost every American in the country became aware of the complete breakdown of civil governance up in Boston. Then finally, in August of 1876, the council took a third vote, anonymously this time, and Jesse's sentence was commuted to life in prison and solitary confinement. He was 16 years and 9 months old, and had been condemned to spend what remained of his life almost completely alone. As the years went by, Jesse was interviewed in his prison cell by a journalist from the fledgling Boston Globe. He claimed to have taught himself several foreign languages, including Hebrew, and stunned one visiting German-born psychiatrist who found that he had learned German with considerable accuracy. This suggests that Jesse was in possession of a sinister kind of intelligence, one that could have enabled him to remain undetected for so long. Jesse wrote poetry, studied law, and spent decades composing legal challenges to his conviction. A 1914 psychiatric report noted that Jesse had made between 10 and 12 determined attempts to escape, and that he'd lost an eye attempting to destroy a wall of his cell by redirecting a gas pipe. The same report asserts that Jesse had shown the greatest ingenuity and a persistence which is unprecedented in the history of the prison. As a result, Jesse's sentence was commuted from permanent solitary confinement to life imprisonment among the general prison population. Jesse partook in regular prison life for around 12 years, but by 1929, he was an elderly man in frail health. He was eventually transferred to the Bridgewater Hospital for the Criminally Insane, where he died on September 29, 1932. His death marked the end of an old and sickly man, still suffering due to the crimes of his youth. Perhaps it's unjust to punish a man for the crimes of his youth, and this is why juvenile murderers sometimes see only a decade inside of prison. But perhaps there are some who are born with an urge to kill, one that will never be beaten or conditioned out of them, no matter how hard society tries. During late February of 1995, high school janitor Dennis Freeman and his wife Brenda lived in Salisbury Township, Pennsylvania, with their 3 sons. The eldest was Bryan, followed by David, then young Eric, who remained the baby of the family despite him being 11 years old. The Freemans were deeply religious and raised their sons as devout Jehovah's Witnesses. Yet while they were receptive to the scriptures at an early age, Bryan and David grew to resent their parents' religion and instead chose to place their faith in something far from holy. As Bryan and David entered their mid-teens, their parents began to notice something about their clothing and behavior. Both boys shaved their heads to the scalp and began to adopt a more military style of dress. They wore combat boots, camouflage pants, and a variety of bizarre-looking t-shirts featuring strange, cryptic symbols. Then came the day that Bryan returned home with the word berserker tattooed at the crest of his hairline. His strict religious parents were apoplectic at the decision, but there was just one problem. They were terrified of Bryan, and they weren't the only ones. Almost all of Brenda Freeman's friends and neighbors found Bryan to be extremely intimidating, and although he was never outwardly violent, the threat loomed constantly. Dennis found that he could no longer verbally discipline his son without Bryan barking back, and thanks to his incessant weightlifting, any physical confrontation with his son would be short-lived and one-sided. It was a huge problem for the Freemans, a problem only confounded by Bryan's influence over his little brother David, who returned home one day with 2 small words tattooed just above his eyebrow: Seek and Heil. Having her sons behave so savagely was one thing, but realizing that they were descending deeper into neo-Nazi politics was a whole other kind of crisis. Brenda quickly contacted a handful of regional psychologists, each of whom advised her to place her sons in what was referred to as a deprogramming session. In cooperation with local police, Brenda convinced her sons to attend a number of anti-skinhead educational sessions run by the state police. But sadly, despite their repeated attendance, the sessions failed to have any measurable effect on the 2 boys. As time went by, Bryan was admitted to the hospital after being diagnosed with a serious mental illness, while David was placed in several juvenile detention facilities to combat his rampant substance abuse. These events kept them away from the family home, isolating them to the extent that between the years of 1993 and 1995, Bryan and David returned home only 5 separate occasions, and on one of those involved a violent altercation following a disagreement over the use of the family's car. Another involved the Freeman parents visiting Bryan's high school, following his suspension for drawing racist cartoons in a school textbook. Bryan's father told him his patience had run dry, and that as soon as he was 18 he'd be kicked out of the house to find his own way in the world. When Bryan rejected the ultimatum, his father told him the only way he'd be staying at the house was over his cold, dead body. Bryan took this as less of a threat and more of an invitation. On the night of February 26, 1995, 17-year-old Bryan and 16-year-old David arrived at the Freeman family home in the company of their cousin, 18-year-old Ben Birdwell. The trio had caught a movie that evening, but when they arrived back at the house, a confrontation quickly arose. It was very late at night, and both the boys' parents had been asleep in bed, so when Brenda began berating the boys on their loud and unruly behavior, she did so from the top of the stairs. She told cousin Ben that he had to leave and that the boys either quieted down or removed themselves from the house completely. Upon hearing this, Bryan essentially told her, "Make us." His mother then marched down the stairs, furious at the display of insolence, yet it was merely a trap. As soon as she reached the bottom of the stairs, Bryan grabbed her by the throat, then forced a piece of dirty laundry into her mouth to stifle her screams. He then produced a kitchen knife that he'd kept tucked inside of his belt, and began plunging the knife into his own mother's chest, over and over again, until she fell silent and still. The boys then climbed the stairs, entering the bedroom of their 54-year-old father as he slept. Then, after surrounding the unconscious man at his bedside, The boys smashed his skull to pieces with a metal exercise bar and an aluminum baseball bat. Following the execution of their long-suffering parents, only one member of their family remained alive. Perhaps at any other time the boys might have made a more level-headed decision regarding what to do with their baby brother, but in the moment, while they remained in the grip of some terrifying bloodlust, the boys barely debated before coming to a resolution. Little Eric had to die. The sleeping boy was beaten to death in the same manner his father was, and the only consolation is that he didn't realize what was happening. Once he was dead, Bryan and David took their father's 12-gauge shotgun and fled the scene in their mother's 1988 Pontiac convertible. The following day, Dennis Freeman's sister, Valerie, paid her brother and his wife a visit after they failed to answer their telephone. She found the front door locked, but the back door open, and when she entered the house to search for her brother and sister-in-law, she was greeted by a scene more horrifying than she ever could have imagined. A coroner based in Allentown, PA, later said that the Freeman murders were the most brutal, stomach-churning crimes that he had ever seen in all of his years on the job. He stated that the faces of the victims had been so badly disfigured that they were completely unrecognizable. Given the Freeman's boys' history, as well as the fact that they were nowhere to be found, police correctly assumed their involvement in their family's murder. They were tracked down to a small Michigan town where they were attempting to lay low in the home of a fellow skinhead named Frank Hesse. The police closed in, surrounding the home, and arrested the two boys after storming the residence. In order to avoid the death penalty, Bryan Freeman pled guilty to his mother's murder, while the younger David confessed to the murder of their father. Ben Birdwell, the boys' elder cousin and potentially their gateway to extremist ideologies, was also put on trial for the murder of his aunt and uncle. Each was sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole and were all sent to separate prisons. It should be noted that the day after the Freeman boys were tracked down and arrested, a bizarrely similar murder occurred elsewhere in the Lehigh Valley region. On March 2nd of 1995, 17-year-old Jeffrey Haworth shot and killed his parents, George and Susan, with a hunting rifle. He attempted to evade justice, but he was arrested just 2 days after the killings, after his car ran out of gas on a Missouri highway. At his trial, it was confirmed that Haworth had been inspired to murder his parents after hearing of the Freeman murders, but later that year, he was found not guilty by reason of insanity. However, his acquittal didn't mean that he was clear of any punishment, and he has since been confined to the Wernersville State Psychiatric Hospital, which houses Pennsylvania's most criminally insane. It is measurably harder to be released from such an institution than it is for convicted murderers to be released from prison, and in all likelihood, Jeffrey Haworth will die a patient there. Perhaps Jeff was always bound to murder his parents, in a way that wasn't necessarily true with the Freeman boys. They made a conscious decision to commit an act of pure evil, after slowly brainwashing themselves with a steady stream of violence and hate. But in committing their act of familicide, the Freeman boys tipped young Jeffrey over the edge and triggered a severely mentally ill young man to murder the very same people who'd brought him into this world. It seems that such an act of violence are like drops of water on a still lake. The area of impact might be small, but the ripple effect extends far further than one might ever expect. Click the join button to become a member today for exclusive content. Mary Flora Bell was born on May 26th of 1957 in the northern English county of Northumberland. Her mother, Elizabeth Bell, was a well-known escort who often abandoned her children for long periods of time when traveling to surrounding cities for work. Mary was her second child, born when she was still just a teenager, and the identity of her father remained unknown. Instead, she was partially raised by a violent alcoholic criminal by the name of Billy Bell. Mary was an unwanted child, and as a result, she suffered from severe neglect and abuse. She frequently suffered injuries following household accidents, leading some in her family to suspect that Elizabeth was deliberately harming her infant daughter. On one occasion, Elizabeth dropped a 3-year-old Mary from a first-floor window, and on another, she plied her daughter with sleeping pills in lieu of securing a babysitter, just so she could head out for a night on the town. She is also known to have once sold Mary to a mentally unstable woman and was only recovered after her older sister searched high and low to bring her home. By the time she started school, Mary was exhibiting several symptoms of severe psychosis. She was known to openly urinate while sitting in class and retaliated to her classmates' teasing with ultra-violence. In one instance, she attempted to suffocate another child and was only prevented from doing so by the swift intervention of her teacher. In another, she held down a playmate in the school's sandpit and forced her to swallow so much sand that the girl was hospitalized. As a result of her abhorrent behavior, Mary found herself ostracized by other children, and her only friend was a 13-year-old neighbor girl by the name of Norma. Norma shared one of Mary's more violent tendencies, and this proved very dangerous to the other neighborhood children. On Saturday, May 11th of 1968, a 3-year-old boy was discovered wandering the streets that Mary and Norma frequented. He was dazed, weeping, and bleeding. The boy told police that he had been playing with Mary and Norma on top of a disused World War II-era air raid shelter when he had been pushed from the roof to the ground. The impact caused a severe laceration to his head, but he was unsure which of the girls had pushed him. The same evening, the parents of 3 small girls contacted police to complain that Mary and Norma had attempted to strangle their children as they played in a sandpit. That evening, a then 10-year-old Mary received a visit from the police, but she staunchly denied being present for the boy's fall and insisted she and Norma had stumbled across him shortly afterwards. Then, when confronted about the attempted strangulation of the 3 young girls in the sandpit, Mary denied all knowledge, but when the police spoke to Norma, she told them everything. According to her, Mary had asked one of the girls, "I wonder if I choke you, you will die," before she wrapped both of her hands around the girl's throat and squeezed. "The girl started to go purple," Norma said. "I told Mary to stop, but she wouldn't. Then she put her hands around another girl's throat and she started going purple as well. Another girl, Susan Cornish, came up and Mary did the same thing to her. Police notified the local authority of the incidents and of Mary's violent nature, but due to their age, both girls got away with nothing but a warning and no further action was taken. To understand the backdrop of Mary Bell's childhood, one has to have a base knowledge of the socio-economic situation at the time. Post-war Britain was essentially in ruin for the better part of a decade following the cessation of hostilities. Food was rationed, poverty was rife, and it took a long time for government investment to reach the further reaches of the country. It wasn't until the 1960s that this wave of urban renewal reached northern England, and it turned some neighborhoods into giant construction sites. Huge craters and rows of derelict houses became common sights, and with a complete lack of parkland or play centers, children were left to roam the streets in order to keep themselves entertained. It made for an extremely ugly environment to grow up in, and it made for a very dangerous one too. On May 25th of 1968, the day before she was due to turn 11, Mary Bell found 4-year-old Martin Brown playing in nearby St. Margaret's Road. She approached the boy, and once certain that he was alone, she lured him into the derelict house at number 85. Once upstairs, and safely out of sight of the street outside, Mary attacked the hapless young boy, throttling him until his heart stopped. The boy's body was discovered by 3 of his friends at approximately 3:30 p.m., and after raising the alarm, a local workman attempted to perform cardiopulmonary resuscitation. But sadly, he was unable to revive little Martin Brown. But as he stepped back, almost in tears from the sheer horror of what he was seeing, 2 little girls appeared in the doorway of the derelict bedroom. It was young Norma and her friend Mary Bell, come to show her what she'd done. After being shooed from the house by the still horrified workman, Norma and Mary walked over to the home of one Rita Finley, the late Martin Brown's aunt. There, they hid their delight in breaking the bad news to her, even going so far as to exaggerate the condition that he was found in to subtly twist the knife. Little did the girls know it, but Mary had conducted something resembling the perfect murder. At the time, there was no DNA or advanced forensic evidence, and the manner in which Mary had killed the boy made identifying the cause of death almost impossible. She was too weak to do any real damage to the boy's throat, and instead of strangling him in the traditional sense, she had slowly suffocated him over the course of a few minutes. This meant that there were no discernible bruises around Martin Brown's neck, which completely threw investigators off the scent. Some even suggested that the boy had died of poisoning, possibly after finding his way into an old medicine cabinet and confusing the pills for candy. The day after Martin Brown's murder, Mary and Norma broke into an old abandoned nursery in an adjacent neighborhood. There, they left 4 scrawled notes. 2 of them read, "We did murder Martin Brown," and, quote, "I murdered so that I may come back." The other 2 notes contained homophobic slurs and are too obscene to repeat. The police were informed of the graffiti a few days later when workmen entered the property to begin renovations, but it was dismissed as a cruel and childish prank. Yet the pranks didn't stop there. Just a few days before little Martin Brown's funeral, Norma and Mary called at the home of the boy's mother and asked to talk to him. When the grieving June Brown told the girls that her son had passed away, they laughed before asking to see him in his coffin. Before June could even react, the girls ran away laughing. A few months later, on the final day of July, 3-year-old Bryan Howe was playing in the street outside his home. The boy was last spotted in the early afternoon before he suddenly seemed to vanish. His parents and siblings searched the surrounding streets, but there was no sign of young Bryan, and as afternoon passed into evening, a sizable number of search parties were combing the surrounding area for any signs of him. The search ended at approximately 11:10 p.m. when one of the search parties arrived in an old railway yard named Tin Lizzie. There, lying between 2 large concrete blocks and covered in dirt and clumps of grass, was the body of little Bryan Howe. His lips were blue, and there were several large bruises and scratches upon his neck. A local coroner concluded that Bryan had died of strangulation and that he had been deceased for up to 7.5 hours before the discovery of his body. His killer had clamped his nostrils closed with one hand while they gripped his throat with the other. Numerous puncture wounds had been inflicted on the child's legs before death, apparently with a pair of sharpened scissors, and sections of his hair had been cut from his head. But perhaps the most striking aspect of his mutilation was the large capital letter that had been carved into his stomach. It was the letter M for Mary. The discovery of Bryan's body sparked one of the largest manhunts in the history of the Northumberland police. More than 100 detectives from across the region were assigned to the case, who set about questioning more than 2,000 children regarding their whereabouts on July 31st. 2 of these children were Mary Bell and her friend Norma. Both girls gave evasive and contradictory answers in their initial statements, so were questioned further the following day. In her second interview, Mary Bell claimed to have seen Bryan playing near Tin Lizzie while holding a pair of sharp-looking scissors. Quote, "I saw him trying to cut a cat's tail off with the scissors," Mary claimed, attempting to incriminate the boy in some other crime. In reality, she had only incriminated herself. No one else knew that a pair of scissors had been used in the murders, not the press, not the public, only the police and little Mary Bell. Instead of choosing to arrest her, the police took a novel approach to their pursuit of Mary's confession. Instead of pressuring her in an interview room like any other criminal, detectives approached Mary's parents to share evidence of their daughter's guilt. They did the same thing with Norma's parents, and once it was clear their daughter was responsible, they pressured her to come clean. A few days later, Norma told the police everything she knew, including how Mary Bell had strangled and stabbed the child, while later admitting that she enjoyed it. According to Norma, when the trio were alone on the Tin Lizzie, Mary seemed to go all funny, pushing the child into the grass and attempting to strangle him. A drawing Norma made of the wounds inflicted to the boy's abdomen precisely matched those described by the coroner, confirming that she had indeed seen the poor boy's body following his murder. At dawn the following morning, the police raided Mary Bell's home, and when confronted, she displayed an alarming knowledge of her legal rights for an 11-year-old girl. "I will get a solicitor to come get me out of this," she reportedly screamed while being bundled into a police car. A forensic examination of the girl's clothing revealed the gray fibers discovered upon Bryan's body were a precise match to a woolen dress owned by Mary, and that the maroon fibers upon the child's shoes were a precise match to a skirt owned by Norma. Furthermore, the same gray fibers had also been found upon the body of Martin Brown, implicating Mary in a murder she'd almost gotten away with. One of the detectives working the case was named DCI James Dobson, and after Mary was arrested, Dobson recognized her from Bryan Howe's funeral. He claimed that she stood outside the Howe household as little Bryan's coffin was carried past. She stood there laughing, he later said, laughing and rubbing her hands, and I thought, my God, I've got to bring her in. She'll do another one if I don't. The trial lasted for 9 days, with the jury taking just 3 hours to reach their verdict. Mary Bell was cleared of murder but convicted of manslaughter on the grounds of diminished responsibility. Norma, on the other hand, was acquitted of all charges. Upon hearing the jury's verdicts, Norma clapped her hands in excitement, whereas Mary burst into tears as she was led from the dock. The judge described Mary as a dangerous individual who posed a very grave risk to other children. He added that steps must be taken to protect the public from her, whereupon she was sentenced to serve an indefinite period of imprisonment. At the time of Bell's manslaughter convictions, she was 11 years and 6 months, making her the youngest female killer in British history. She was eventually released from Her Majesty's Prison, Ashcombe Grange, in May of 1980 at the age of 23. She had served 11.5 years in custody and was granted complete anonymity, allowing her to start a new life elsewhere in the country under an assumed identity. Her current whereabouts are unknown and remain protected by a 2003 High Court order. One journalist, who was granted an interview with her, claims Mary accepts she was fairly convicted and freely admits the abuse she suffered as a child does not excuse her crimes. She is also now a grandmother, a woman who's watched 2 generations of her descendants grow up. But it's hard not to wonder if at some point during their youth, Mary Bell looked at them and remembered hunting children just like them, back when she too was just a child. Born on March 29th of 1967, Ricky Kasso Jr. grew up in a comfortable middle-class household in the small town of Northport in New York State. His mother and father were employed at the nearby Cold Spring Harbor High School, a well-funded, highly acclaimed institution that offered them generous salaries. They were attentive, well-meaning parents, but both were harsh disciplinarians, and it seems their child-rearing style had the opposite effect on young Ricky. As he grew into his teenage years, the clashes with his parents grew worse and worse, meaning Ricky was often kicked out of the family home for extended periods of time. His parents believed that a night on the streets would knock some sense into him, even if those streets were some of the safest in the state. Rather than run home with his tail between his legs, Ricky found that living off the grid wasn't nearly as difficult as it seemed. In the summer, Ricky would sleep in a makeshift camp in some nearby woods, then, in the winter, he'd either couch surf or break into cars to sleep on the back seats in a bundle of blankets. It was through his life on the streets that Ricky became friends with a loosely affiliated group known as the Knights of the Black Circle. It was essentially a dumb name a group of metalheads gave themselves, and they were far from being a conventional street gang, but the group remained heavily involved in the sale and distribution of narcotics in their small hometown. Their mainstay tended to be beer and marijuana, but as time went by, they began to experiment with LSD, PCP, and mescaline, the sale of which funded their nightly misadventures. For the most part, the group's interest in drugs and heavy metal was purely recreational. They were symbols of teen rebellion, and at their core, the majority were good kids. But Ricky Kasso, on the other hand, he took to the heavy symbolism much more than most. At first, Ricky's friends thought his interest in Satanism and the occult was pretty cool, but it soon became obvious that it was no casual interest. He claimed to have once spent the night alone in the Amityville horror house, desperate to communicate with whatever spirits still lingered there. He also went out of his way to purchase a copy of Anton LaVey's Satanic Bible, but rather than confine it to the bookshelf as a kind of countercultural trophy, he studied it intently, over and over again, until it was practically committed to memory. Ricky also went way harder than his friends when it came to psychedelic experimentation. Not only did he dose higher than everyone else, but Ricky often tripped on his own, off in the woods, surrounded by satanic paraphernalia. His love of LSD became so debilitating that Ricky's parents had him shipped off to South Oak Psychiatric Hospital in Amityville for drug rehabilitation and psychiatric care. After showing signs of improvement, He was released back into the care of his parents, but without the specialist addiction counselors, he quickly fell back into old habits. After one particularly intense trip, Ricky was discovered desecrating a colonial-era grave inside a local cemetery. Following his arrest for the crime, Ricky claimed that he had heard the long-dead person begging to be released from their coffin. Shortly after this incident, Ricky contracted pneumonia, apparently in such a weakened state from chronic drug addiction that he had to be hospitalized. During his hospital stay, Ricky's parents tried to convince the doctors to commit him for involuntary psychiatric care. But according to hospital psychiatrists, Ricky's antisocial behavior was neither psychotic nor violent, and that all the boy needed was a lengthy detox. On top of that, Ricky seemed desperate to get out of the hospital. Apparently, he had a score to settle. Ricky was embroiled in a feud with a 17-year-old named Gary Lowers, with Ricky convinced that Gary had stolen around 10 bags of PCP from him while he was passed out at a party. Ricky and Gary had already clashed over the accusation, with Gary promising to pay him back for the theft, but once he became lax with repayments, Ricky subjected him to a vicious beating. The cycle was repeated on 4 more occasions, with Gary sometimes flat out refusing to pay back what he owed. Then finally, Ricky decided that Gary had to pay. One night, Ricky joined 2 of his friends, Jimmy Triano and Albert Quiones, in inviting Gary to come and get high with them. Gary was suspicious at first, but Ricky assured him that bygones were bygones and that he'd paid his fair share in blood. As a peace offering, Ricky offered Gary several free hits of microdot LSD, and after Gary accepted, the 4 boys walked deep into the Astakia woods to set up camp and build a fire. It's not clear at which point the ambush occurred, but at some point during the evening, Ricky lunged at the unsuspecting Gary and sank his teeth into his neck. After tearing out a chunk of Gary's flesh with nothing but his teeth, Ricky laughed as his prey writhed around in the dirt, stricken with mortal terror. He then produced a knife and began to repeatedly stab the fallen boy in the chest and stomach. Gary was stabbed at least 30 times, and his eyeballs had been cut out during the frenzied and sustained attack. Jimmy Troiano and Albert Quiones later testified that Ricky had told a dying Gary that if he shouted, "I love Satan," his life would be spared. But once he did so multiple times at that, Ricky simply finished him off with a few well-placed stab wounds to his heart. Following the concealment of Gary's corpse, Ricky boasted of his misdeeds to friends, claiming that Satan had manifested himself in the form of a black crow at the moment Gary's heart stopped beating. When some of his friends accused him of telling tales, Ricky led them to the spot in the woods where Gary's body lay, kicking the dirt from his face to prove that it was him. They stayed quiet for 2 weeks, until the local police received an anonymous tip on July 1st of 1984. A few days later, police sniffer dogs located Gary's severely decomposed body and granted him a proper burial. Ricky Kasso was promptly arrested, along with his 2 accomplices who facilitated the murder. But a few days later, Ricky was found hanging in a cell, dead by his own hand. There are many murders that have been blamed on heavy metal, video games, or other alternative art forms. 9 times out of 10, it's pure media fear-mongering, but Ricky seems to be the exception that proves the rule. Perhaps some kind of undiagnosed mental illness was to blame because, although his parents were strict, they certainly weren't overly abusive or domineering. Plenty of kids endure being grounded and yelled at without resorting to stabbing another's eyes out in the name of Satan. Some have theorized that Ricky was suffering from some kind of LSD-induced psychosis, and that's what set him apart from his scampish, fun-loving metalhead peers. But others have argued that Ricky actually believed in the power of satanic worship, and that to him, it was as real and potent as the power of prayer. Similarly, there are those who deny that Ricky took his own life because he was scared to spend the best years of it in prison, and rather, that he wasn't in the least bit afraid to die, because he truly believed that he'd descend to meet his master. Hey friends, thanks for listening. Click that notification bell to be alerted of all future narrations. I release new videos every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday at 7 p.m. EST. And there are super fun live streams every Sunday, Tuesday, and Thursday night that I'd love to see you there. If you got a story, be sure to submit them to my subreddit r/letsreadofficial, and maybe even hear your story featured on the next video. And if you want to support me even more, grab early access to all future narrations and bonus content over on Patreon, or click that big join button to hear about the extra perks offered for the channel. And check out the Let's Read podcast, where you can hear all of these stories in big compilations and save huge on data, located anywhere you listen to podcasts. All links down in the description below. Thanks so much, friends. And remember, humpsters hate dumpsters.